right. Well, welcome back to part two of landing your next job in L&D. I wasn't sure when I originally recorded part one if I was going to be able to make it in one. And instead of making it an almost 2-hour single session, I decided I'd chop it up and make it part one and part two. So if you don't remember, you didn't watch the first one, I would recommend going back to it. But giving a little more context, reemphasizing the context on this is I'm doing this just because I know right now there's a lot of folks who are either recently dealing with a job loss, are facing a job loss, or just in general with the overall uncertainty are doing as much as they can to stay current and relevant, to be prepared in case something happens, or maybe be proactive about doing something. So for those of you who are going through that right now, again, my heart goes out to you. I've been there before. Personally, I know how stressful that is, how hard it is. And so I just really wanted to take some time to share from my perspective some things that I think can be really helpful for you. And I'm sharing this from some of my own personal experience, some of the lessons I've learned, some of the wisdom I've gleaned from other leaders in the industry and others in counterparts to our function who deeply understand how to think about this. They may run talent acquisition. I've gotten a lot of coaching and feedback from folks in that field. So I'll share some of the wisdom I've gleaned from that. And there's also my perspective as a hiring manager. I've hired a lot of folks in the field, and some of the things you're going to hear from me are things that if I were the one doing the hiring, I would be looking for, or I would be considering. A lot of the things I'm sharing are also things that are regularly part of my repertoire and things that I do to help me stay current, because to me, that's really important for my own personal and professional development. So if you missed the first one, definitely go back, because in that one, what I talked about were the first two chunks, which was about building your skills and staying relevant as an L&D professional. So what are some creative and meaningful ways that you can do that, address some of the common ways people do it, and give a little bit of perspective on how I think about that. Then the other piece was networking. And for me, especially networking as an introvert and someone who has a very busy family and does not have a lot of free time and freedom to be able to go do the traditional things, and that you can actually be successful in building a strong, powerful network without necessarily tapping into all the traditional ways of doing that. Now, I will also give the same warning and caveat that I did to the first one, which is heads up, disclaimer, this is Christopher Lynn's perspective and personal lived experience and things like that from this. This is not a guaranteed. I am not making any promises that if you follow this guidance or if you do what I tell you, this is for sure 100% the way. And hopefully if you listen to the last one, you know the nuance that I give to things, the discernment and critical thinking around each of these. I don't necessarily think there's always a right or wrong way. There are a handful of things where I said everyone should be doing this regardless, and here's why. And I make the case for that. But there's a lot of things where I recognize it's situational, and there's personal nuance that has to be taken into context when you're making these decisions. So I will make the same invitation. I don't know if I made this invitation, but I will make this invitation. If anything I say, or as you're personally wrestling with some of these things, if you ever just want point of view or perspective, if there's anything I can do to help, don't hesitate to DM or reach out to me and say, hey, heard what you had to say on here. Here's my personal situation. Do you have any specific thoughts given that? Because what I'm trying to do is offer the broadest context that I absolutely can, given the fact that this is a very broad area and there is a lot of nuance, but I also recognize there's a lot of specificity that happens in people's personal situations and things that I can't take into consideration when I'm sharing to 30, 40,000 people globally from all different sorts of industries. So hopefully that goes without saying, but I just want to reemphasize that in case there's anything that, comes up as, well, that doesn't necessarily make sense for my situation. Well, it may not. And I may, if I knew your specific situation, have some different perspective or nuanced guidance that I would give with it. So without further ado, with the next two, and this will probably be slightly shorter than the last one, although we'll see what happens here. The next two parts I'm going to talk about are standing out in the application. Like, how do you actually differentiate yourself in the application piece so that you stand out, but don't do anything foolish? And then the other one is when you actually interview, what is some advice that I would give to folks who are interviewing and how do you make the most out of that? So let me jump into the standing out in the application piece, and I'm going to make a little bit of a timestamp here. The one thing that I would say with this, and don't be discouraged if you're someone who is out of a job or facing a job loss and is now like in a situation where you have no choice but to do this. But I say this advice to people because oftentimes what I find is people do not start thinking about their next job until they're in a position where they have to have their next job. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for people to be playing the long game, playing chess instead of checkers around this thing. Now, I want to be careful how I say this, but one of the worst things you can do is wait until you need a job to start actively pursuing your next job. Now, if you're in that situation, listen, it's not doom and gloom. You're beyond salvation and there's nothing that you can do. You can work through it, but you are at a disadvantage. I will just tell you, you are at a disadvantage, which means you're going to have to put your A game on to be able to overcome that. And I think that's one of the biggest things. So if you're hearing this and you're not in dire straits, or you're not in a situation where you're out, my biggest encouragement to you is don't wait until you are to take some of the advice or to consider some of the things I've recommended in these 2 series, because you are facing a much steeper ascent if you are just getting started on some of these things when you're out of a job versus if you are doing this earlier. And what I mean by that is, here's one of the things that I would say is, you don't have to wait to apply for jobs until you're actually looking. I think one of the things that I encourage people who've even worked for me to say is, I'm not opposed. In fact, I would encourage you to apply for jobs that are interesting to you, even just to see, is there something there? Now, that may sound terrible as a hiring manager. You may be like, what? You actually recommend that people? I think in some ways it's actually a career retention strategy, and that a lot of times it can be easy to think that your situation is so dire and it would be so much better somewhere else. And one of the best ways you can break that is by actually saying, well, go explore it. And you might quickly find out it's actually not all that bad. And you actually have it pretty good compared to some of the other things. So I would just encourage people not necessarily to wait until they do this. Now, if you're in a situation where you actually are looking for a job and it's one of these, like, I need to apply. I can't just do this as like a skill building experiment and networking thing. I actually need to apply for a job because I need a job. One of the other things that I see as a miss that I'm going to say in terms of the application piece is, don't only apply for the jobs that you're convinced you already want. And I see this happen so often with folks where people go, I want this job. And so in their job search, they are only looking for the jobs that they've already decided that they think they want. They read the job description and they go, no, I don't think I'd like that. I'm not going to apply to that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't restrict yourself from this, because you got to remember the job thing is a funnel. For all the jobs you apply for, the ones you actually interview for is going to be significantly less. The ones that you actually get offers for are going to be even less. The ones you would actually consider accepting the offers for is going to be even more narrow than that. So if you're already filtering this funnel down to this in the beginning, you got to remember that thing's narrowing at an exponential rate, and you don't want to be doing that. I remember going back to a story of early in my career when I was doing this, and I was in a situation where I was in a job, but it was a horrible situation. It was an awful situation. And I knew I needed to find something else. My initial phase, I was doing this, narrowing the funnel, where I'm like, well, I really only want jobs like this that are here, that are in this kind of industry. And I very quickly decided, you know what? I'm actually going to get really creative in this. And at the time, I was so broke, I could barely pay my rent. I was eating ramen noodles, and to get internet, I would go park in a bank after they closed because I couldn't even afford internet. And then I would take my laptop, and people probably thought I was crazy crunching on dry ramen in the car as I'm applying. I remember applying to hundreds of jobs that really, they were kind of directionally relevant, but I'm like, I'm going to be open and creative, and I'm going to let the interview filter this. Like if I go through an interview, and I think that's one of the mindsets we have to overcome sometimes when it comes to jobs, is we're like, Well, I don't want to apply for this job because I may not want to take it. Okay, finding a job is a two-way street. It's just as much about you vetting that employer in that role as it is about them vetting you. And I think sometimes we are remanded to this idea that, well, we have to prove we're worthy and they're vetting us. And it's like, I encourage people all the time, no, you are not. You are vetting them. You are empowered to say, listen, I may apply for a job. I may even get to an offer and I may go, I can tell you there are a number of times I've gotten down to an offer that even negotiated the offer and ultimately said, you know what, this is ultimately not going to work out. And I think that's something that now, do you want to just be reckless with this and take a bunch of jobs to offer and walk from them? No. So please do not take me advocating that. That's foolish. And you're going to burn some bridges big time if you do that. But should you go into a job and be like, I would not take this role when you know nothing about the job, nothing about the company, nothing about the hiring manager, and eliminate it as a possibility? No. So if you are in this situation where even if you're considering, maybe your job is secure, but you really are thinking, I just don't feel like there's enough development or enough thing, then I would say open that up and say, well, what are some of those outside the box jobs, some of the sister brother jobs of our field or things like that where I may explore that, you know what, maybe very quickly in the interview process, and don't be afraid to withdraw from the process. I think that's another thing. Sometimes people go into this and they feel like, well, if I apply and then I get called, I guess I got to see this thing through to the end. No, you don't. No, you don't. You can go into it. And if you quickly realize, you know what, this is not for me. Now, be diplomatic and respectable. That's the biggest advice that I would give to people if you don't want to torch bridges, is go into it and be diplomatic. But it's okay to say, you know what, upon further evaluation and getting to know a little bit more about this, I don't think this is going to be the right role for me. And it's okay for you to withdraw from that, even if it's something that they're interested in you. And I recognize sometimes there's this like, ooh, they're interested in me, so now I want to, whatever. But you got to remember that funnel's closing. So just because you get a call back doesn't mean that it's going to offer. So if you start smelling something weird or there's red flags sitting around, don't feel like you're somehow obligated to stick it out. And I think this goes back to the fact that it is a grind. I mean, when I have been on the job market, it's a grind. It's a grind. And is it less of a grind as you build more of a brand and build more of a reputation? Maybe, but it's still a grind. The interview process is brutal. The application process is brutal, type of a thing. And you know what? I hear a lot of the complaints and I get it. I understand it. But the reality is it's the name of the game. And the idea that you can skip steps and do well, my personal experience has been, it's not going to happen. But I think the other piece is to not take that personally. And I think that's one of the hard things when you're going through this is it's hard not to start questioning your own worth and your own value when you feel like, man, I just keep applying or I keep having these initial conversations type of a thing. And they just don't go anywhere. Now, one of the things I will share with this, because this is something, especially folks I talk to who are earlier in their career, but even sometimes more seasoned folks, we've all had that instance where you have the like knockout conversation with the recruiter and you're like, wow, I crushed it. It felt like we were just jamming and they felt like it was and then nothing. And you're like, how on earth did that happen? One of the things that I think, and this will help you not take it personally, because I think sometimes what that can do is it can leave you feeling like, wow, did I just misread the situation? Did the recruiter just totally present something that wasn't real, tell me everything was great and they felt good about it, when in reality they were like, woo, that was a bad one? You got to remember, a lot of times the disconnect between the hiring manager and the recruiter sometimes is quite wide. And the recruiter may have little to no information of the actual things that the hiring manager is looking for. The hiring manager may have just pulled the job description from a library, passed it over and said, start recruiting, had zero conversations with this person, maybe some light conversations. So you got to remember that recruiter may be operating off of very limited information. And sometimes even if the manager has given them some context, they are not L&D people. So they may not even understand. And what you're saying may really resonate, but then the way they convey it back to the hiring manager may not be accurate. And so you've got to, this is, I don't say this to say you can necessarily fix it. Are there ways that you can mitigate it by maybe being able to connect with the hiring manager ahead of time, or connecting with someone who knows the hiring manager who can kind of set you apart? I think there are some ways you can mitigate that gap, but can you fully mitigate it? No. And so I think I just share that because this is one of those times where it can be taken very personally. And I would just encourage you not to take it personally and recognize some of this is just the messiness of the hiring game. And you know what? There are casualties of war when it comes to this. On that topic, though, I am gonna address one thing where it's a risky game. I've seen lots of career feedback from folks saying, reach out to the hiring manager. Do so carefully, okay? And the reason that I say this is this can be a good thing or this can be a bad thing, in that it can put a hiring manager in a really awkward position where if they meet with you, you might be inadvertently putting them in a position where they now feel awkwardly obligated if they were to move forward with you, and they don't want to have that difficult conversation. And as a result, they may not even interview you so that they don't have to deal with it. I'm not saying that's what happens all the time. I'm not saying this is consistent. What I'm saying is you do need to be careful with that. And so what's the alternative? And again, some people may argue with me on this and say, no, absolutely. Reach out to every hiring manager. It's a really positive thing. But I can just say, as a hiring manager, for me, I think I've gotten to the point where I don't get awkward with it. But I remember early in my hiring manager days, I was really uncomfortable with candidates reaching out directly to me and asking, hey, I'd love to grab coffee and chat with you, whatever type of a thing. In some ways, companies don't always like it because you're subverting the process. In some ways, it puts a hiring manager in a weird position because now they've interviewed you before they interviewed you, and you may actually show your cards too early and be a little too eager. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that can get messy. Now, again, am I telling you never do it? No. And again, some people would argue with me vehemently, but my personal experience, just sharing from a hiring manager's perspective, is there are different ways I think you can go about that if you want to get on someone's radar. And the one I shared before in terms of the networking is get to know people who are in that person's sphere of influence is actually, in my opinion, a more effective way to bridge that gap than to try to go directly to the source. Because going directly to the source, of course, they're going to feel like, well, of course, you're going to show me the best version of you. But hearing from someone in their sphere of influence may actually be a better alternative. And again, that may mean not saying, hey, person who's in their sphere of influence, can you introduce me to hiring manager? There you're just adding an additional step to the awkwardness potentially, versus get to know that person who's in their sphere of influence and see if they would be comfortable connecting the dots or making a recommendation or something like that. That may up your chances without adding the layer of awkwardness. And it also gives you another conversation point, because now you can say, oh, we both know this person, again, making it on a more personal level. So again, just a personal watch out and consideration. Again, not to say don't do it, but something to consider with this. All right. The other thing that I want to talk about on this one is some of the things I see out there about crazy resume hacks. Should you put together an infographic, PNG, really fancy creative resume type of a thing? Should you do some of these zany things, put a bunch of decorative stuff on a birthday cake and send it to the hiring, right? Going back to like even introducing yourself to the hiring manager, some of this stuff can backfire. And you may think like, wow, I'm really standing out. And instead you may be making the hiring manager going like, ooh, this person's a little crazy type of a thing. I mean, I'm just talking candidly about sometimes how people think about things. So I think you got to be careful with this. And let's talk the resume piece, the infographic thing. The one thing I think we need to recognize that we should just be more transparent about is company application systems don't deal well with a lot of these weird not weird, but like creative resumes where you come up with this thing that's a PNG and it's all, a lot of times they don't even handle resumes with like tables well. let alone, so I've seen old school feedback, like put all the keywords from the job description in your resume and change the text to white so it triggers the AI to think that you're a perfect match. I've seen some of these games that people are told to do to try and stand out. I've actually seen it backfire more than it's worked well for them. The ATS, the applicant tracking system, just straight up rejects the resume or doesn't see any of it because it's in this funky format that it can't translate and do anything with. So as a result, it just says like, this person's not relevant to this. So when people ask me about this in terms of like, what if I do something creative or things like that? My advice is, and I've said it in the networking piece, like if you're only using LinkedIn to just create a boring version of your resume on a social media platform, that to me is a miss. I mean, you can showcase work on LinkedIn. To me, that's where you should do it. Because going back to pattern of behavior, as a hiring manager, I'll just tell you, the first thing I do when somebody comes across my desk, I go to their LinkedIn. I go to their LinkedIn and I see what they have out there. So if you've done some of this cool, creative, outside the box stuff, to me, that's where I want to see it. Well, I mean, I guess I would take it if it came to me, but honestly, half the time when I just think of like how processes work, I honestly, a lot of times don't have time to look at some of the stuff that gets sent through. I'm glancing at it very quickly, where I may spend more time digging into somebody's LinkedIn profile and seeing it out there. So you may actually get more of their attention if you put it out on LinkedIn, and you avoid the risk of the ATS geeking out because you thought you'd be cool and make an infographic that's in a wild format that the ATS, you saved it as a PDF, but the ATS doesn't know what to do with it. And as a result, just rejects the whole thing. So that's one thing I would put on that piece. Let me address the personalization and cover letter thing. I've been asked, do I do a cover letter? Do I do a pain letter? Do I do some of this stuff? Do I go hyper personalization on the resume, like completely rewrite my resume for every single job? Here's Christopher Lynn's take on it. I don't think I've seen a ton of return on that kind of time investment. So I've had cover letters in the past, didn't really get much benefit out of doing it. It was a lot of work that didn't really go anywhere. I used to spend tons of time personalizing resumes for every single job. Didn't really see that make much of a difference. So I'm probably going to get other people who are going to say, yes, you absolutely should. But I personally would say time investment. Would your time be better spent doing some of the networking activities, maybe showcasing your knowledge on LinkedIn or trying to get on a conference speaking circuit and speak at something? Do I think your time would be better spent on that than doing these other things? Yes. Now, should you do some degree of personalization and make your resume a little bit more personalized? Yeah, you should make it a little bit more personalized, like highlight some of the key things. But again, you got to remember that job description likely was not written by the hiring manager. Sometimes it happens, but a lot of times it's not. The hiring manager might just be pulling from a thing. So you may be doing a whole lot of personalization that has nothing to do with the hiring manager, what they care about. And so you actually may be working against it because maybe that's an old, outdated thing that they just used and put in the system. And now you personalize it to this. The hiring manager gets and goes, ugh, that's not what I'm looking for in a candidate, because they're pulling outdated stuff. So that's my cautionary thing around how much time do you spend on it. Should you at least try and do some stuff to make it a little bit tailored? Yes. The other thing I would say around resumes, some of the best feedback I got on resumes was your resumes should tell enough to someone to make them curious, but not tell them enough that they can decide on whether you're a good or bad candidate for the role. And I think that's one of the things where I see people fall on either ends of the spectrum of this. Either their resume tells me nothing that I just don't even have enough to know whether I want to have a conversation with this person, or it's a TLDR white paper on everything this person has done. And then I can make a decision based on reading the resume. I'll glance at the resume and go, nope, I already know everything I need to know about this person. The sweet spot in that resume space is right there when you go, it's enough to make somebody really curious. Your goal should be to make the person looking at it go, I want to talk to this person. I want to find out more about some of the things they said on here. So I think that's my best advice when it comes to resume is get that sweet spot of it's enough to make someone curious, tells them enough, but makes them curious, not so much that they can make a hiring decision on it. So there's that. Couple other quick things that I would add. Be careful when you're applying through non-company websites. I've had people reach out to me in the past at other companies and do different things where they're like, "Hey, I applied to this job. Is there any chance you can pass me along to the hiring manager?" And they did it through some random website that's essentially a website aggregator. The thing that you got to be careful with this is a lot of times those aggregators are outdated. So by the time they get the job's either like already filled or well on its way. And so now you're late to the game because you're pulling it from it. The other thing is a lot of times if you're asking somebody to make an introduction or a referral or something like that, a lot of times what's really helpful is to have the requisition number. What is the job rec? A lot of these third-party sites, they don't have that information. So when you ask somebody, "Hey, I'm looking for this," you're forcing them to go try and figure out like, "Well, what job is this and where is it and who's it report?" Like, I don't know, versus being able to just look up the rec and see, is it still even open? Who does it report to, type of a thing. The other thing is you may be saving yourself time because you may find, "Hey, I applied on Indeed." And even if it manages to make its way through and land somewhere, you're probably going to end up having to reapply on the company website anyway to get into their HRIS. So just be really careful with that. I've seen people get really discouraged when it comes to applying, and I find out, oh, you're applying through all these third-party ZipRecruiter and Indeed and all these other things. It's like, well, how do you even know that's getting back? Like, are those jobs even still vacancies in the company? You might end up running on a treadmill that you aren't going anywhere. The other thing I would just say is don't, and I mentioned this before, don't only apply for jobs that you want. I said that before, playing the long game. Like, don't only apply out for jobs that you think you already would accept. So just for the sake of time, I'm going to jump to the interviewing piece here. Let me make a note here, 27:40. On the interviewing, got about 12 minutes left here. And probably more than this, 4 things that I would really, really, really say is on this one. One of the things, and I'll just tell you this, the worst thing that you can do in an interview is have it be awkward. Honestly, that is one of the worst things you can do is have the interview be really awkward. And that may sound like I don't know if that is traditional or non-traditional interview advice. But just as a hiring manager, there is nothing worse for me and probably no greater indicator that this is probably not going to be somebody that I'm going to move forward with than if that conversation is really awkward and uncomfortable. And so how do you get around that? How do you get around that? Because what you don't want is 30 minutes into an hour-long interview, it's like, so anything else? You just do not want that because it's just creating this perception that, well, this isn't somebody that I just really want to spend time working with. So what can you do about it? Couple things. First of all, one, I don't know that people do enough around storytelling. And I think this is a skill. And this is why I say, I don't think you need to wait till you need a job to practice interviewing for a job. And to me, this is one of the biggest gaps I see when people have been in a job for a very, very long time, and then they lose a job or they leave a job, and they're so out of practice with interviewing, they've forgotten how to have these conversations. And that storytelling piece is really critical. The number of times over the years that I've interviewed people and I've asked them to tell me about something or give me, tell me how this actually played out. A lot of times, again, going back to my resume advice, chances are that person had a resume that made me inquisitive about something that was on their resume. And so a lot of times what I found over the years is sometimes I'll ask a question about it. Like, tell me about that. What happened? How did that work? And the storytelling just isn't there. It's just, well, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. It's just running through a checklist of stuff instead of telling a really compelling story. And I think this is a skill that you can build. This is a skill you can grow and get better at. And I absolutely would advocate and think that you should, because this is an opportunity, an area to really stand out and have the person go, wow. I mean, you can do the research yourself, but look at the power of storytelling, even over data. People will believe and follow a story over facts. They can be faced with the facts and somebody tells a compelling story and they will ignore the facts because the story bowled them over. And that's a skill that you can build, is how do you actually, and this is something that you can do even if you're not looking for jobs, is look at your experiences, look at the things you've done, and figure out what are the compelling stories you can tell about them. And think about, look at the actual architecture of a good story. There's a problem, there's a hero. I mean, there are different styles of stories, but think about how you can integrate these stories into the challenges that you faced. And believe me, if you're in L&D, you're watching this, we have faced some crazy stories. We have faced some heroic challenges in our careers. And it's always disappointing to me when I talk to people and I don't hear those hero stories. I don't hear those, compelling stories that draw me in, that really make me go, wow, you were quite the character in this cast of, in this story. And I think this is something that vastly gets missed. And that's something that can really directly connect you to that person and make you stand out, because ultimately in the interview process, that's your goal. You want to showcase your skills and you want to stand out. And you're not going to do that by running through a checklist of everything you did. And going through a PowerPoint. Here, let me just list off all the things that happened in my last job. Here's a report card of what I did and how well it worked. No, I want to hear the stories behind it. So I think that's one of the things that I see missed, that anybody who's in the space, build those storytelling skills. Practice your stories. Practice telling the stories of your career to people and think about how they connect to things. The other one is, get to know your interviewer as a person. I think, again, the goal of this is to make this as not awkward as possible. And a great way to do that is to get to know them as an individual, get to know who they are and what are the things that matter to them. And that can help you then also connect your stories, because any good story is tailored to an audience. You have to tailor your story to an audience. Now, does it mean you make up facts and you can, no, hear me now. Do not do that. Do not just make up tall tales to tell and impress people, because also any good hiring manager is going to see through your tall tales. And if they ask you a follow-up question and you're stumbling because you have no idea because you made it up on the spot, you're going to fall flat on your face. So I am not advocating tell tall tales. What I'm saying is take what you've done and figure out how to craft it into a story, then get to know that person on an individual human level so that you can personalize and emphasize parts of the story to that person that makes you really stand out and stand above anyone else in there. The last thing that I will say, and then I'll give my concluding thoughts on this, are I personally have always done this, and this is something that I tell to everyone. You should go into an interview with enough questions to fill the entire time. So if you have a 90-minute interview, you should have enough questions on your list that you could ask questions for 90 minutes. Going back to the point of the last thing you want in an interview is get to a point where it's like, so do we got anything else to talk about? Type of a thing. And I will just tell you personally, as a hiring manager, I always ask, what questions do you have? And if somebody says, I don't have any, I think I've gotten all my questions answered. Maybe it's a personal bias, probably is, but to some degree, that tells me a lot about someone as a candidate. Somebody doesn't have any questions, tells me they're not thinking deeply about the role. It tells me they aren't thinking deeply about the conversation that we just had. And this is, again, one of those things where you can prevent awkward silence by making sure that you have questions to fill that space. So I think that's such a simple one. And don't make sure your questions are thoughtful. Don't ask, do you have any pets? I mean, maybe you could if you're getting to know them on a personal level. I don't want to say there's any bad questions, but hopefully you know what I mean when I say don't just have dumb filler, small talk, how's the weather type questions. Have deep, thoughtful questions. I love when people ask me about the culture of the organization. What were some of the biggest challenges I've faced when I entered the organization? What are some of the biggest challenges I'm looking to tackle? How do I see this role fitting into the part of the larger strategy? Again, I'm showing my hand a little bit, but I'm doing it hopefully to benefit folks because I know other hiring managers, and this is the kind of stuff they look for in a candidate, is somebody who can ask questions and actually seems genuinely, not seems, but is genuinely interested in what we're trying to do as an organization or what we're trying to do with this role and how this role fits into this. And you're not going to get there if you don't ask really meaningful, thoughtful questions. So again, if you're ever curious about what kind of questions or you're really stumped, those are things you can ask. Those are things, again, DM me outside of this. Ask some, what questions do you think would be really good questions? I'm happy to help with that. But this again is a skill. Asking good questions is a skill and you can build it. And you can build being a good storyteller and asking really good, thoughtful questions and engaging people in dialogue. And I will tell you right now in an interview, that is something that will make you stand out and stand above other people who are going through that process. Because the honest answer is, I can just tell you from interviewing a lot of people, the majority of people in an interview are running through a checklist. Their goal is just to tell you and talk at you as much as they possibly can instead of actually engaging you in a dialogue and in a conversation. Now, the last point, and sometimes when I share this feedback on interviewing that I get from folks is, well, but how do I do that when I go into an interview where someone they've got their HR checklist and they are just firing through the list of things that they need to get done in their checklist. You have more control of this conversation than I tell people all the time. You have more control of that interview than you realize, but you have to take it. And some people I've talked to have said, what are you talking about? Like, how would I actually do that? If somebody just asks me a question, and I think this goes back to similar to what I said, where you apply for a job, you feel this just natural tendency to feel obligated. Well, I better see this through because I got called back and then I got rejected at the end anyway, type of a thing. You control that conversation and you have the power to do that. And honestly, while you may think that may turn off a hiring manager, and again, maybe there are some hiring managers, feel free to comment in or whatever. But honestly, I actually love when candidates run the conversation and make me feel like they're driving where they want it to go. Because the bottom line is, in the hiring manager, I'm in a position of power where if there's something I need to make sure happens, I will make sure that happens. I will make sure I get to it. And a good candidate in that conversation at the end will make sure they ask a thoughtful question of, is there anything that you need to know about me or that I wasn't able to communicate to you that you want to make sure you get to before we end this conversation? A good candidate is going to ask that and make sure you open the door for me as a hiring manager to do that. But honestly, this is my personality. I'm not worried about somebody dominating the conversation and I'm not going to know how to handle it. And I think this is something where a lot of times in the candidate space, we feel like we're in the back seat, just going where things are at. And so we'll get a question, tell me your biggest weakness, right? We get all these ridiculous questions when you're interviewing. I've been there. I hate them. And we feel like, well, I guess I'm just going to answer it. And then you answer it and then they ask another question and you're just like, ugh. But you have more power to flip the script on this than you may realize. And I think there's a lot of techniques and ways that you can take a question that may go, okay, I don't even like the question you just asked. And so I'm going to, in a very Socratic way, flip that around and ask a question back. You may get a question, tell me about, well, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but tell me something about this. And you may be able to flip it right back around and go, can you tell me a little bit more about what would be most interesting for you to hear about that question? Because there's a number of different ways I can respond to that question, but I'm curious why you're asking that so that I can understand what is it that you're looking for, not to tailor my answer specifically to just tell you what you want to hear, but to be able to make sure I'm highlighting the best example that I can to show you how I've done what you're looking for, type of a thing. And there's really a lot of different ways that you can And I could probably do a whole podcast just on how do you flip that around and how do you drive that conversation? Because again, this is a skill. So going back to interviewing, storytelling is a skill and you need to build it and you need to practice it. You're not going to do this just by like magically watching a TED talk on how to do it. You need to practice it. Knowing how to ask thoughtful questions and engaging in a meaningful dialogue with someone, that is a skill that you need to develop. Driving the conversation and flipping questions when you're put in awkward situations, that's a skill. That's not something that happens by accident or you just pick up by, thinking it through or, thinking through how am I going to answer if I get this question? You can't flip card your way through a good interview. And I think that's one of the biggest things. And I'm going to close on this that I want to encourage everybody on is that there is a way to do interviewing really well. And there are some core skills that you can focus on and you can develop to actually make yourself stand out and stand above everyone else that you're interviewing with. And hopefully, if all goes well, land the job and accept it. So with that, I know we're only at 41 minutes, but I want to wrap this up because otherwise this will be another one that'll just go way too long. Hopefully you found this helpful, and I may do a part 3 in terms of what happens when you actually get the job. How do you think about that? What things can you negotiate with? I may make that a community only one. We'll see what happens with that. But anyway, hopefully you found this helpful and valuable. For all of you out there, again, my heart goes out to you if you're going into this season in a tough spot. I know it's hard, but keep your head up high and hopefully this helps you land that next job. We'll see you on the other side.